You know, you're a nerd when non-functional requirements are one of your favorite tech topics, because that is like pretty nerdy. Anyway, so we're going to talk about non-functional requirements. It's often referred to as NFRs, and I don't mean no effing requirements. I mean, these are non-functional requirements. They're kind of run in parallel or a different piece of the requirements process. And you can kind of think, if I was going to build a house, and the requirements would be like what the rooms are going to be like, blah, blah, blah. The non-functional requirements would be like the building codes. What does the concrete got to be look like? What does it take to get power hooked up? What kind of power do you actually run to a house? Typically when I design my house, I don't say, I want this cable with these colors on it for the electrical. And so in this case, those would be non-functional requirements for your house. So let's talk a little bit about non-functional requirements, right? And actually, I have this repo out there with this content in it and some non-functional requirements as examples, and we'll cover those in another talk because I don't want this one to be too long. So non-functional requirements are architecturally significant because they impact system design, right? So there are things that we got to decide. We're going to do encrypt PII, personally identifiable information. We need certain metrics to be generated so that we understand what's happening in the application. Those will create architectural or design changes in the system, and therefore they become requirements, non-functional requirements. They sit outside of the business functionality. So if the business functionality is I need to place to store account information for a bank account, right? That's a functional requirement. We need to be able to save and retrieve that bank account information. But the non-functional requirement is the bank account information's got to be protected. Our APIs have to have authentication in them. There's just a bunch of these things, what they need to look like. So these constraints, these non-functional requirements will change the shape of your app. A lot of times we do these as an accident, as an afterthought. Really, like a lot of these talks, this is really about thinking about this up front, right? Like, what is this going to look like up front? And collecting those, or at least understanding what they're going to be, and then teams aren't surprised. Hey, you never told me we were going to have to do logging. You never told me we were going to have to generate events. You never told me we were going to have to do blah, 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 right? And that's because these non-functional requirements aren't owned by the business. They're actually owned by the technology team. So, I think in a lot of ways what we're trying to do is shift left. We're trying to make the developers and development teams, delivery teams be more responsible for the things that happen and to own more of it. And I feel like if we're going to do that, if we're going to enable people, we got to give them as much information as possible so that they make the right decisions. And in that case, it means we need to at least not plan when they're going to happen, but understand what non-functional requirements, what NFRs need to go into a project. And so not everything is an NFR, right? There are some other things that are just policies. We're going to do something by policy. And so just because you can think of a million things doesn't mean they're all going to be NFRs. And these NFRs are really enablers, right? If the NFRs are implemented in a library or they're thought up in advance, they enable you to keep the applications running for them to function correctly. And then we have these other things. So I tried to come up with a list of things that might be thought of as NFRs, but they're not, right? So an automated smoke test, that might be an NFR or it might be a policy, right? Our policy is that every deployment has to be smoke tested. In some ways, because it's owned by the development team and it might change the way the app works or change the architecture, then it would be an NFR. But if it's sort of this external thing and you weren't shifted left, you didn't build it, you own it, then in that case, it's really a policy. Right. The one that gets me a lot of times is a run book. Hey, we need to create a run book. A lot of companies I've worked with, pretty much everyone, they wanted you to create a production support. Run book. A lot of times now it's just a wiki page. Who to call? What is the primary health checking? Where are the dashboards located? That's a policy, right? Or a goal or something else. But run book is not an NFR because it doesn't change the architecture. It doesn't change the way you build the app. It might, because you realize you can't support it in production, but that's a little bit different problem. So another one that's confusing to me is like software metrics, right? There are software source metrics and, which are really design time, right? Like when I write code, that's not a runtime metric. That's like at design time. What did that code look like? And so some of these feel like NFRs. And the only reason I'm going into this, I'm going to go into some more NFRs, like good ones, or like what I would think solidly are NFRs. A really good example of an NFR, like I said, was encryption. Data at rest needs to be encrypted. PII needs to be protected. We're going to use UTF-8 for character strings. All our apps here is UTF-8, so we don't have to worry about some 16, Unicode 16. I just made that one up, or EBCDIC, or like ASCII, right? Like I've seen places where they have a mix of character sets. That's really bad. So like in this one, I was trying to figure this out. So testable code is an NFR, right? Maybe, but it's really a policy. It does in a lot of cases. The only reason I could see that testable code, unit testing, would be an NFR is because it would change the shape of code, right? So but it won't change the architecture. It might a little bit to make it testable, but I would actually argue that's a goal, right? We want testable code. It's a and it's not an NFR, it's a company policy. And if we had a target for unit test coverage, that's not an NFR, I don't think. It's owned by the dev team, but it doesn't impact the architecture. So, and somewhere there's a gray area. I've seen people just throw a bunch of stuff into NFRs because it's the only place they have to capture needs. But a lot of times for SDLC and software, the right way to write software, I'm not convinced that that's an NFR because it's not about the app itself. It's a general thing. So, when you have NFRs, so like one of them I just mentioned was all characters need to be UTF-8, or metrics must be generated for every request. Logs must be structured. Those are all NFRs so that they work with the tools we've got. If you want to get a list of what NFRs are, then an example, Wikipedia, there's this link, will take you out there. I'll put this link in the presentation. And then the Scale Agile framework has a lot of info. Well, they have one giant wiki page about NFRs. And so really what happens though is if I have a million NFRs, right, like, it's got to be deployable anytime. It's got to use the latest libraries, or CVEs must be patched. Nope, see, that one might actually be a policy. So we'll go back and we'll look at some of these character set I'm going to use as an example. APIs must have documentation. APIs must be authenticated and authorized, right? Those would be an NFR, so that we don't stand up some endpoint and then never put security on it, those kinds of things. So those can be divided into categories, and those categories, there's a bunch of different sites that have different ideas on what those categories, and why do we bucket in categories? Because it makes it easier to manage. If I show you the TSV file that's at the top of this repo, there are currently 53 NFRs in it. It doesn't make sense to not have a way to organize them for humans, right? So you can go to these websites. Like I said, I'll put this GitHub repo in the presentation, and you can go to these sites and get an idea on the categories. And so when you write an NFR, you can use whatever requirements thing you want. Scaled Agile Framework says not to use regular requirements. NFRs are actually enablers or constraints. So I made up some examples of categories and sub-example categories in the repo, the other TSV file that you'll see. So typically, like one of the things you could do, we just kind of tried to close in on this and make it as easy to do as possible. And I love tables. So in this case, what we said was, hey, if we're just going to make a table, one row per required NFR, what would be the smallest number of columns we could get with? And some of these might be kind of big. So we have a category, we have a subcategory, we define what the requirement is, we give a possible implementation. What I want to do is separate the requirement from the implementation. And why do we want to separate the requirement from the implementation? Partially because we want to come up with an acceptance criteria, we want to come up with a validation. So in this case, typically what we'll have is a category, a subcategory, interoperability, and I don't know what the next one would be, character sets or something. And then the requirement definition, hey, you got to use UTF-8. No, we need to use the same character set. And the implementation would be we're going to use UTF-8, and we're going to validate it by checking the character sets of all the apps with tests to make sure everything coughs up UTF-8, right? Now, it turns out, I talked all that, but here's a good one, right? Maintainability is a category. A lot of people have that. And the subcategory is going to be unit testing. And this one I picked, and I just said before, I'm not sure if this is an NFR or a policy, but let's pretend it's an NFR for this discussion. All code modules must have full unit test coverage, whatever that means. And the possible implementation would be we're going to use XUnit. This would be C#. Use XUnit for testing and Sonar for measuring results coverage, right? That should be coverage, not converge. Oh, another typo. Anyway, and then the validation is we're just going to look at the coverage results, right? So this is sort of like if you're going to do a metric, then you got to come up with the indicator, KPI, and in this case, the KPI would be, we got to make sure that we have this unit test coverage. We're going to measure it with Sonar, and then we're going to run reports or fail builds potentially that's how we're going to validate that. So Safe actually has a little bit more on theirs. They because it's a lot of it's about estimation, right, and understanding the cost of something. In their case, they like attributes that have numeric values, KPIs, right? So they have a name. So like in the case of that unit testing, the KPI would be coverage. The current target would be where we're currently at. The final target would be like 80, 90%, whatever it is. And anything below 75% is considered a failure, right? So there would be operational metrics too, right? Average response time. Response time is the KPI. That's not actually a business requirement. The current KPI, the current value for response time is 1 second. The target is a half a second, and anything over 1.25 is considered a failure, right? So that would be, they would take into account this cost. So if you did that, you end up with this 5 categories I had before, and you can see, and then I ended up with the meters, the metrics. So we put what's the metric, what's the scale of the metric. So in that case of code coverage, it would be line LOC covered or something. And then we'd have what the target was, what the failure constraint, and what the current value is. And so this really just adds 5 extra columns to the NFR. And this one would be continually, the current would end up having to be updated on a regular basis. But anyway, so this is cool. And so this is the way Safe calls for it. And you could do it either way. In the examples I did, where I did general NFRs, I didn't put the metrics on here because I just coming up with, hey, I'm throwing down a bunch of NFRs. What do you guys think? Are all these required? And if they are, we could do the Safe thing afterward and do actual metrics on it, or we can just start teaching the team, hey, these NFRs are things you need to take into account for everything you build. So I have a current NFR list here. It's in a TSV file and it's on GitHub. I'm not really going to walk through it right now because that'll be a different talk, but you can see here, security, encryption at rest, security, encryption in transit, security, we're going to do authentication. I have a couple different NFRs around different things with authentication. So we'll come back and do this one another time because we're out of time here, and I hope that was useful. And what I would say is if you're doing any project, pretty much any project, create a set of NFRs. Be thoughtful about what your non-functional requirements are. Have a great day.